Now, we are being joined by Colonel Rich Oudson, the Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and the Jamestown Foundation. Thank you for being with us. Now, this is a rapidly developing situation with horrific scenes coming out of Israel. Is this an intelligence failure with a coordinated attack of this nature?
Well, thanks for having me, Allison. It's good to be with you. It is absolutely an intelligence failure on two levels for the Israelis. The first is the failure to note the timing of the attack. It was tactically and operationally a surprise. Obviously, the videos that have come out now showing Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters at some military bases, Israeli military bases along the fence line and near it, taking some IDF soldiers captive, including reportedly a senior ranking officer, a general, shows that they were not expecting this when it came. That's one level of intelligence failure. But at the operational level, also the fact that Hamas has deployed some new capabilities here. If we compare this, say, 15 years ago to the attacks in 2008, there was about 2 weeks of fighting near Gaza before the focus of fighting shifted up north with Lebanese Hezbollah. But the fighting around Gaza was a sideshow. A couple of tunnels, some kidnappings. This is different. So what Hamas has showed this time is not just the 5,000 rockets they fired, but the ability to penetrate on the ground through tunnels at multiple points simultaneously, reportedly at least 60, and perhaps more into the hundreds of people who came across to Israeli communities, and some by sea as well via boat. So rockets by air, infiltrations on land via tunnels, and then by the sea. They took over Israeli communities, at least 3 as of an hour ago. Small Israeli communities were still in the hands of these Hamas fighters. They killed the regional council president, and again have taken at least 35 captives. This is an altogether different level of capabilities from Hamas. So while condemning this terroristic attack on the civilians, rightfully so, as Israel and the United States as its ally do, we have to also note that they've grown some capabilities here that intelligence should have picked up on from the Israeli side, and I think that's the second level of failure.
Absolutely, Colonel. And what is required by Israel now? Is a ground incursion required? And what happened to Israel's Iron Dome defense system?
Yeah, that's one of the big mysteries right now. Iron Dome seems to have not knocked down the majority of these missiles that are being fired. Now, it'll take probably 24 to 48 hours for evidence and data to come out about how many rockets total were fired. We've heard 5,000. Certainly some have been shot down, but by video evidence alone, we know not all of them have. So Iron Dome, while not completely ineffective, has not been the wonder shield, and that's a technical failure. Perhaps there's a new type of rocket, or perhaps the operators were just not expecting this scale. Remember, Iron Dome is a good system, but when you have a massive bombardment of rockets simultaneously, it's hard to hit all of those at the same time. So I think, in a sense, Hamas overwhelmed Iron Dome through surprise and mass of those fires. Now, what Israel needs to do now, and Netanyahu has said he'll do this, first is to clear out whatever Hamas fighters are still on Israeli territory. And if there was an initial invasion force of 60 or 100, some of those have gone back. They took hostages and went back. It shouldn't take that long to clear out the rest of those fighters. And the second thing he said Israel will do is to exact a high price. Now, this is where Israel has to be careful. In my view, what Hamas is actually trying to do here, in addition to grabbing hostages and negotiating based on those hostages, they're trying to derail Israel's diplomatic sort of reconciliation and normalization with the region. Countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey and the Emirates and so forth will be watching very closely to see the nature of the response. If it is targeted towards Hamas and respects civilian communities, does not engage in sort of mass civilian casualties and things like that, then I think while it will be a long process, they'll be able to strike down these capabilities that Hamas has built up. On the other hand, if they overreact, if they go for a full ground invasion, this is going to lead to a very problematic cycle in terms of what Israel's trying to do diplomatically in the area. And I think that's what Hamas wants. So a disciplined and steady response that is precise is what Israel needs to do now.
Colonel, as you said, there had been some hopeful talks just before this going on geopolitically. between Saudi Arabia and the US, hoping for some push toward concession to the Palestinians. That's certainly unlikely now.
Unfortunately, I think that's right. I think that the strongest card diplomatically for Palestinian understandings with Israel was represented in this Saudi normalization push, because the Saudis, unlike some of the other countries that have normalized with Israel, really seem to have put the plight of the Palestinians front and center, saying, yes, let's move towards normalization, but give a better deal because our people care about that. And that, as you say, that is greatly complicated by this very bloody. And remember, Israel, like any other country, they're humans, right? And the scenes of Israeli women, there's a picture of a 75-year-old woman with a gun to her head, and then Israeli women being dragged through the streets into Gaza. There's going to be a bloodlust that comes from this, and that's going to have to be controlled. But restoring some level of desire to make a better deal for the Palestinians is going to be very difficult in the wake of this.
And Colonel, we know that Israel has launched their counterattack with an air raid across the Gaza Strip. What other details do you have in Israel's response so far in this attack?
Well, I think that if we look at the history of these types of operations, there's almost always a ground component if it's been a major blow by Hamas. And I think what we saw in the week or two prior to this operation by Hamas was multiple demonstrations along the fence line, sort of lulling the Israelis into thinking that all sorts of activity along there was normal. So I think what Israel's probably going to have to do is a ground operation that will remove or create more depth there to keep Palestinian civilians away, and the tunnels that were used to create this attack, to move those further back away from the border. I don't think that they're going to have a multi-division ground operation into the middle of the urban centers in Gaza, of which there are 4 or 5. So what I would expect is a couple of days while they build up force, and then some incursions, targeted incursions, to put pressure on the Hamas to move them back off the border, and frankly, to put pressure on them economically and militarily to give the hostages back. So there will be a ground op, I predict that, but I don't think it's going deep into the urban centers. That would not play to the Israeli strengths.
And Colonel Hamas, we heard that they called on the resistance fighters in the West Bank, as well as other Arab and Islamic nations, to join the battle. Has there been any response from these calls?
None that I've seen. I did see that on the Twitter account from some Lebanese Hezbollah link groups, they said, we are closely watching events and coordinating, which means I think they were taken by surprise, right? So I don't think that there's going to be an immediate escalation in the north by Lebanese Hezbollah. And frankly, the Israeli Defense Force presence in the West Bank and the constant series of arrests and raids of extremists and militants in that area makes it very hard for there to be anything significant. I would expect there'll be some isolated incidents, fire bombings, maybe some explosions. The thing to watch will be to see if Lebanese Hezbollah thinks it's in their interest to launch a major provocation in the north. Now, my bet is no, because again, it looks to me like they were surprised by this, but there'll be some minor demonstrations of solidarity through violent acts. I don't think any Arab states are going to jump on board with this, because there's just too much political risk, if nothing else, because of the terroristic nature of the actions and the violence against civilians. So I don't see any Arab armies coming to their rescue. There might be some small terror attacks.
Absolutely. And we have seen many international countries coming to Israel's backing, saying that they, of course, condemn this horrific attack and that Israel has the right to defend itself and its sovereignty. Now, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas said that the Palestinians have the right to defend themselves against, quote unquote, the terror of settlers and occupation troops. What do we make of this statement by President Abbas?
Well, look, you have to have some sympathy for Abbas in this scenario, because the Palestinian Authority, not Hamas, which runs Gaza, but the PA centered in Ramallah, has followed a very different path. They have tried to seek statehood through building a state in conjunction with the Israelis, right? And so what they've seen over 15, 20, 30 years, really since the advent of the Oslo period, is the failure of negotiations and the failure of the state building project. So they are between a rock and a hard place, because to the more radical and militant Palestinians, including those in the West Bank under PA control, they say, look, all of this, the talking, the negotiation hasn't worked. The Arabs have abandoned us. The West has abandoned us. We need to fight. Only through the gun will we. And Abbas doesn't really believe that. But at the same time, he can't afford to directly criticize people that are fighting, even though that's not his path. So I have some sympathy for him. I think, his statement about settlers and about occupation forces, ironically, doesn't really apply as much to Gaza. Why? Because the Israelis are not occupying Gaza. They're not in Gaza. And there's no settlers in Gaza. Ariel Sharon pulled them all out in 2005 and 6. But this statement applies a little bit more in the West Bank. Frankly, the Israeli presence there in terms of military and security is more onerous for the average Palestinian in the West Bank than it is in Gaza. So I guess he negotiates this rock in a hard place by expressing sympathy and criticizing Israel. Well, I'm certain he's actually not pleased at the level of civilian suffering that's going to go on for the Palestinians as a result of this.
Absolutely. And Colonel, if we look at the Gaza Strip, it is under the close eye of Israel. It is a small piece of territory. How did Hamas manage to get this kind of weaponry together enough to break through the heavily militarized border zone between Gaza and Israel?
Well, tunnels, and occasionally small boats. Really, I mean, the nature of the ground underneath Gaza, it's sort of porous and sandy, and there is a constant, nonstop effort by the Palestinian terror groups to build more tunnels, both into Israel but also into Egypt. It's very hard to control that. They dig day and night, and they reinforce it with metal and steel. These are used for smuggling civilian economic goods to a certain extent, and also weaponry. Occasionally, there's also small boats and ships that come in. The Iranians have had a long-running program of trying to infiltrate weapons and explosives into Gaza. And then to a certain extent, there's a homemade industry, especially for rockets and things like that, where in small foundries, the Palestinian terror groups have found a way to make their own rockets, and they're increasing the technology of that. So it's hard because they are under a constant observation and more or less a blockade. But they've proven with this set of attacks that I guess that project's working better than the Israelis and the West had given it credit for.
Right, and Colonel, the Israeli army says that Hamas will face the consequences and responsibility for these events like they have never seen before. What do you see happening in the near future now?
Well, it's hard to say. I think the range of options would be on the light end, kind of what I was talking about before, a limited ground incursion that would take over border crossings down on the south to Egypt, fight their way in and control everything that comes across through the formal border crossings, and then take sort of a buffer zone along the fence to make sure that the resistance groups or terror groups can't approach that. There could be an extended series of raids into the urban centers. Well, they'll go in and try to either kidnap or kill senior Hamas leaders. I'm certain there will be an increased pace of drone strikes with targeted intelligence and either drones or planes striking at Hamas leaders whenever they poke their heads up. At the very furthest end, this could be the end of the experiment of Hamas rule in Gaza, I suppose. The Israelis, back in, I think, 2006, this was a point of disagreement between the United States and Israel when there was going to be open elections as part of the democratic process in the Palestinian Authority. The PA in Ramallah and the Israelis were both a little bit hesitant for those elections. They said, look, if Hamas wins, this is not going to be a normal democratic give and take process. They're going to turn this into a terror outpost. And that's kind of what happened. So the Israelis at the time told the Americans, we may not want to let that happen. And the Bush administration at the time, pushing the democracy agenda, said, no, let this happen. And if they have to rule, then they'll be responsible, and ultimately they'll lose power if they don't become more peaceful and provide for the prosperity of the Palestinian people. Well, it didn't turn out like the Bush administration thought. It turned out more like what the Israelis thought, so that Gaza has become more or less a terror outpost for the last 15 or 17 years. It could be that this is the time when Israel says, this experiment has not worked, and we are going to dismantle Hamas rule in this area. That would be a long, extended operation that would require operations in urban centers. It would also involve a lot more deaths on both sides for the Israelis and the Palestinians. I don't think that that's in the cards, but it's conceivable.
Absolutely. Colonel Rich Oateson, thank you very much for being with us, for your valued insights and analysis.
Good to be with you. Thanks, Alison.